Good evening, everybody. This evening, as we're in the run-up to the general election, we are having educationals every week, every Monday, from now until the general election takes place, because we want to put certain issues in the spotlight, because these are issues we believe people should be talking about and asking candidates about. And the issue today is about the crimes of the Crown, crimes where the Crown has played fast and loose with people's lives. People have died. People have had their whole life savings lost. And the Crown just seems to get away with these appalling crimes and is never called to account. So we're going to discuss a few of those crimes this evening. I'm going to ask Steve to start our meeting off. So, Steve.
Thank you, Carol. I wasn't. Thank you, Carol. I'm really going to just to mention, just to begin with, a couple of points, and mainly, I'm going to hand over to Phil and to Mark as well to talk in a bit more detail. But when we're thinking about the problems that this Tory government has given this country, when we start to look deeper into it, there are a whole number of scandals that really don't go down to one particular government. They actually go down to the system of government. And that's what we want to focus on, because what we'd want to say is changing over, getting rid of the Tories for me is absolutely essential to get rid of that absolutely rotten, vile government. But bringing in a Labour government that's going to carry on with the same system is not a solution to the problems that the country faces. So what we wanted to do was to highlight the importance of the political system of the Crown and Crown power, which is illustrated in a whole number of scandals that take a long time to resolve. And I'll just mention some of them. We've had the infected blood scandal, the post office scandal, the Hillsborough the scandal over Hillsborough. I was thinking of the Windrush scandal. I was thinking of Grenfell Tower. There's one coming out today that I was not totally aware of, which was about giving birth, about services, women giving birth, and how they've been treated in the NHS. So there is more, no doubt, going back a long time. So really, that's what we want to bring into the story. That really, if we do not change the way that the system of power works in this country, then we're not going to be able to solve any of these problems. Now, I don't want to say more than that, because I really want to hand over to Phil, I think, to open up and talk a little bit about Crown with respect to perhaps the post office. I might have something to say about the blood scandal, but we'll see how that goes. So I'd like to, yeah, Orgreave. I think did Jennifer say Orgreave? I think she did in the chat, and if I missed it off, I should not have missed it off as well, because that's another one that is in this list, and there are more as well. So I wanted to hand over, I think, to Phil to say at least something about the post office scandal, I think, or maybe the Crown in general, about what we see as the Crown.
Right, thanks very much, Steve. I'm going to bring Phil in now.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, if there are any here. Okay, the Crown is a very complicated entity to talk about, but I just thought I'd quickly flash back to a publication that came out in 1999 called The Nature of the Crown, a Legal and Political Analysis. Steve is aware of this book. It's edited by Sumpkin and Payne, but it has a little, I mean, it's a bit legalistic, but it's quite interesting. And it says the following: the Crown refers to the authority of government and the very entity of government. All people going about the government's business, ministers, civil servants, and others, do so under the cloak of the Crown. Note the word cloak, with its powers and note immunities. The idea of democracy may appear central to our political arrangements, but the legal facts are that the Crown subsists not merely as a power, it is the state. if the legal facts of our political arrangements clash with our individual beliefs about democracy, then that clash is of the highest importance. So this book is available still. It's available on Amazon or wherever you want to get it from. And it really is rather illuminating. I'm not going to refer to it any more than that, but I think it does help if you just want to get a handle on what the legal entity is of the Crown, because it is a legal entity. It has powers. Many of them are wrapped up in the constitutional arrangements we live under. Others are in statute. Others reside in what are called delegated powers, such as those used by Braverman to bring in the police bill, whose powers have been thrown back by the High Court. Liberty, the organisation Liberty, brought a case against it, and the Crown suffered a defeat. And because they abused Parliament, because Parliament had not expressed the opinion that Braverman incorporated into law in its various debates and stages. So this throws up another interest, which I again won't be referring to over much, which is the question of what Parliament does. But I'm going to set that to one side, because we'll be talking about Parliament probably in the next few weeks with the question of the election and everything. So I'm going to move on from there. But just keep that in mind, the Parliament is not completely useless. As we saw in the post office scandal, it was the members of Parliament that prized open, or helped prize open, along with Alan Bates and his very brave sub-postmasters, the oyster shell that was the post office's secrecy and defence. And the grit in that shell, if you like, was the Fujitsu's defective computer program. But I would argue that it's not really about computers. Although that's the ostensible thing that matters to the sub-postmasters, who were grievously robbed of their money, which incidentally went directly into the post office's balance sheet and was paid out later in other things such as bonuses. So all that money they stole. I mean, essentially it's a fraud. They stole from the postmasters, was put into the post office balance sheet, as I think Steve mentioned last time he was here. But what it really is about, I would argue, it's about the preparation by the Crown, because don't forget, the Crown was involved with the post office because it is a public company, it's a state-owned company, it's nationalised. And during the time that Alan Bates was writing his emails to that gloriously inept CEO, Paula Venables, who I've watched. I mean, I'll never get these hours back, Carol, so just please send a message to my family. But I've watched a colossal amount of the inquiry now. I've watched all of Venables, I've watched lots of them. And what they all have in common is they're absolutely useless at their jobs. They would be thrown out of any half-decent capitalist company because they just would be losing so much money hand over fist, and incompetent, that they wouldn't be kept on, because their earnings-related bonuses that they've awarded themselves would not be awarded in a company like that, I'm sure. I mean, just think of the water companies, how careful they are not to award bonuses to people who don't deserve them. So we are dealing with an extraordinarily incompetent setup. What's interesting about this thing is that the Crown was wanting to prepare the post office and the Royal Mail for separation, because they wanted to sell off, privatize the Royal Mail. And this is like the real business of the post office scandal, in my opinion. I'm not diminishing for 1 second what the postmasters went for. Some of them died, many were bankrupted, many were made pariahs in their own communities. So I'm not diminishing that at all, but I am saying that it's it's not the primary element in this, because the crown represents the state, as Payne's book points out, the nature of the crown. It's a legal entity. It has legal powers. And when Alan Bates was emailing Venables and these other people, they were supposed, when they went through this thing called mediation, and this was a scam by the post office to try and stop them finding out about the computer problem. And mediation was basically very craftily put together. And they managed to convince the MPs that this would be a really truthful, they'd come out with all the documents, all that stuff. But of course, they didn't do that. What they did do was they hid vast quantities of data and information from the mediation, and they excluded specifically from the mediation process any of the postmasters who'd undergone legal criminal proceedings and been convicted. So that was extraordinary. How they got away with that, Bates recounts in his evidence. It's a wonderful watch, actually, 3 hours of Alan Bates. You don't need your life back watching Alan Bates. It's wonderful. But anyway, so they were having a back channel to Joe Swinson, that appalling Liberal Democrat minister in the business department of business and trade. And she was under Vince Cable, who was pushing really hard for the privatization of the splitting and then privatization of Royal Mail. And she was running a back channel directly with Venables behind the backs of the people who were going through this con of a mediation process. And so these emails to Alan, from Alan Bates to the post office, were supposed to be confidential, but they weren't. They were shared with the government. And this shows the complicity of the Crown in the crime that was the post office. So to return to my title, The Crimes of the Crown, this is one of the little micro examples of how the Crown operates in a particular context. They stole money from ordinary people, decent, ordinary, entrepreneurial, classic, if you like, classic Conservative voters. Many of them, figures of great respect in their communities who were destroyed by this. But the Crown didn't care, because its main goal was to separate and then sell off the Royal Mail, which it duly did. Has been discovered later, as was said by, it must be said, several Labour MPs, at a very reduced price. The trade unions really opposed it because they said they were giving it away. And now they're doing it again, as you may know. They're giving it away to this Czech billionaire. Oh, by the way, if you still send Christmas cards through the mail, be ready for a doubling of your stamp price by Christmas if it goes through. I'm just tipping you off. Buy now. Okay, so that's the story there. So what is the Crown again? Well, the Crown is a kind of corporation. It has a board of directors. It has the monarch, if you like, as a chairperson. The monarch doesn't operate, massive amounts of powers overtly, but it has power, as a chairman does, to fire the CEO, who is obviously, because formally speaking, the CEO of the company, in this case, it's Rishi Sunak, although he's in a kind of wash-up situation at the moment. But Rishi Sunak is the CEO. He runs the company on behalf of the state for the period of time he's elected. But notice, and this is a little side point. Notice that the country hasn't fallen to pieces because there is no parliament sitting. And why is that? Well, the main reason is that the country would roll on regardless, almost, even if we were in a period of between elections of a long period of time, because the company that I'm talking about, the multinational company, and it is multinational, the British state, because of course it's got interests all over the world. It runs whether there's a parliament sitting or not, because so long as you've got civil servants, so long as you've got programs to do, they all know that they have jobs to do and they will do those jobs. The police don't stop operating. The fire service still operates. The army still operates. All these things still operate. So the Crown is that overarching structure which, come rain or shine, carries on regardless. And then, of course, it's interrupted uncomfortably now and again by elections like we're doing now. We get a chance to just say, can we have, a new boss, just like the old boss, to quote Peter Townsend. And so we get a new parliament coming in the next 5 weeks. But so I want to just move on from my depiction of the Crown as a kind of corporation. It's not an individual, and it's not democratic, and it's distinct from the government because it is in fact also the civil servants and all those other things. The government is what you see sitting in the Commons. You can actually go and talk to those ministers if you want to lobby them, but you don't really get a chance to lobby. Ordinary citizens like us wouldn't be able to lobby a civil servant. And when I said that the Crown can go on regardless, that's because the chief civil servants to the Treasury, the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, all those different chief secretaries, they are there in situ. And the Crown can fire some of them. The ministers can fire some of the CEO when he comes in, be it Starmer can fire some of those civil servants or appoint into Downing Street his own team. But you'll notice that many of them don't disappear when the government changes. Many of them carry on. I mean, the one who left the Foreign Office in protest against Johnson, he'd been there for many years. My niece served under him in the Foreign Office before she left the civil service. So, he'd been there a long time. So they have longevity, these things. And that's what gives us this great British thing of longevity and continuity, which is why we support the monarchy, because it gives us continuity, why we support the Crown, because it gives us stability. And these itties that I'm saying, stability, longevity, all that stuff, that's what is characterized as the great British democracy. But as you'll notice, a huge chunk of it is actually not accessible to the citizen. Now, in 2008, a very capable journalist found a disc, got sent a CD-ROM with all the MPs' expenses scandal wrapped up in it. And what this person did, she published a book afterwards called The Secret State. And in that, it explains, she didn't draw the political conclusions that we do, but she did it. It's a very good analysis of just how hard it is to get to the bottom of what's going on. And that's in Parliament. So Parliament can have scandals as well. But the Crown scandals on a much, much bigger scale. Expenses were something, but this is another thing. And I just want to run through a few of these scandals for you. Now, I want to say in advance, I'm not an expert on football. To my certain knowledge, there's been no scandal at Lord's Cricket Ground to match that of any football ground. But I think you'll understand you can't know everything about all these things. So anyone else can join in on the Sheffield Wednesday Liverpool game, please do. I know more about the Heysel Stadium one, as a matter of fact, because I was living in Italy at the time. Okay, so here we go. What have we got? First thing to say is, what does the Crown do when something goes wrong? Well, the first thing to do is to keep it secret. How does it do that? Well, you'll put forward freedom of information requests, which Tony Blair declared was his worst ever mistake in government, passing the Freedom of Information Act. And you can put in a request, but it can be rejected under many grounds. And some of those grounds are really rather important. And guess who was running the shredder in Johnson's number 10? But Sue Gray. She ran the office in number 10 that threw out and rejected what she thought were irrelevant or impertinent inquiries by journalists. So she's very happily now Starmer's lieutenant. So I don't think I can promise you any greater openness in government when Starmer, looking like I've just read on Labour list with 440 seats in Parliament, 120 for the Tories. When Starmer takes over, I can't promise you more openness. I'm very sorry. But what is true is that these scandals are nothing new. And I'm going to take you back a little bit, not taking too long, because I know that Carol's wants to have other people coming in and you all want to have a word. I apologize, I can't read the stuff coming up on the thread because it's a bit of a distraction, but I'll try and look through it afterwards. I'm going back to Aberfan. Do you all remember Aberfan? You can nod sagely if you do. The Aberfan disaster was a Crown disaster because it was actually the National Coal Board that was found by the inquiry not to have actually looked after the coal tip that collapsed onto this primary school and killed a lot of school kids. And the first strategy of the Crown is always to say it wasn't their fault. When that doesn't hold up after a while, nosy journalists start finding things out, unfortunately. So then you have to be able to say, right, well, we'll have an inquiry. Now, what's the point of an inquiry? I would argue in most cases, I describe it as long grass syndrome, and I shall abbreviate that to LGS, which basically means you kick it down the road, or kick the can down the road syndrome, which is rather a mouthful. So I'll stick to long grass syndrome. Your job is to put the thing off, procrastinate. Now, if ever you've seen Yes Minister, you'll know precisely what we're talking about. Yes Minister is horrifically accurate in its depictions of how the Crown operates. Don't ever fail to watch it if you can. It's Steve and I watched one last week, and it's just too true. And they actually use the term Crown. It's quite encouraging that we're not in the wrong place. But Anthony Jay, who wrote it, really knew his stuff. And so Yes Minister is exactly how it is. They will kick the can down the road. If that doesn't work, then we come to the inquiry itself. Now, what you want with a good inquiry, for the Crown, a really good inquiry is the Bloody Sunday Massacre. That went on for years. And in the end, very little was achieved. Nobody got sentenced to very much. But then we come to the question of compensation. Now, I'm going to talk to you quickly again about Aberfan. Now, Aberfan was 1965, so we do have to multiply the money up a bit. But the total compensation paid out was £160,000, with 500 given to each family who had a dead child. So I think 500, I think that's pretty generous, really. When you consider, it's difficult. We were after the war. We hadn't rebuilt Britain. We needed to save money. So they thought, well, we can get away with as little as possible. And they did. And I remember even then, it was an absolute scandal. People were really angry about it. But the government the Coal Board tried to deny it. Even at the same time was another scandal, and this is to show you that the Crown operates abroad as well as here, overseas as well as here, was the Kenyan veterans scandal. Now, this one was exploded in Parliament because Enoch Powell, just before he became famous for his Rivers of Blood speech, he exposed the Kenyan Mau Mau torture scandal. And it was his speech in the House of Commons that forced the Crown to launch an inquiry, which they duly did. They denied, of course, any massacres had taken place. Kenya's it's very important scandal this for us. I know it seems probably a bit of a side point. They had to bury tons and tons of documentation. Some of it got sunk into the Indian Ocean. Some of it is buried in a huge underground bunker in Berkshire. But it was devilishly hard for the Kenyan veterans advocates to get hold of any information. And intriguingly, I don't normally mention him, but Dominic Cummings slips into the picture here because his great-grandfather-in-law led the violent suppression and torture was responsible for it, of the Kenyan Mau Mau. So it's good to see he married into a classy lineage. Anyway, so the Kenyan one, they had, which brings in another factor which I haven't mentioned. The third strategy of the Crown is to have people dying off. You want as many to die off as possible. Now, they couldn't do that with Aberfan because the children were killed. They hadn't survived, so they had to pay up a kind of lump sum, if you like. But with the Kenyan Mau Mau, at one point, there were quite a number of thousands wanting, claiming compensation. It took them forever to get to the court. The British kept denying it, kept blocking it. And the Kenyan Mau Mau, in the end, there were only 5,228 Mau Mau veterans left, of whom now many more have died, of course. And they ended up getting £3,000 each. Now, I'm not going to list for you here what they did to the Mau Mau, because the torture was absolutely unbelievable, even by what we know about the British Empire. This was horrendous stuff. And the Mau Mau were badly behaved as well. I mean, they did some terrible things too, but they were a resistance. They were fighting to kick the British out of Kenya. The British forces in Kenya were, of course, trying to keep hold of a colonial entity, a colony, but the violence they used was absolutely atrocious. And they only paid the living ones. This is another thing they do. The Crown, they make it, well, it's only for living people. We won't pay for the dead. So many who died on the way didn't get a penny. And that's what they do. They slow it down, make it last as long as possible, so they hope everyone's going to die. The next one I'd mention, again, Bloody Sunday, I mentioned it before, they got different amounts, 75,000 averaging, but some got 210,000, others got more, others got less. But again, that one dragged on so long that many people were dead who were relatives who should have been compensated for the loss of their children. Many of them died, or brothers and sisters and so on died. So the Savile report started in 2010, but as you know, it only finished relatively recently. So that's a great example of long grass, where you keep it going as long as you can. You're trying to make sure that as many die or as many give up, or that's what you want. You want people to give up. That's what they hope with the postmasters. And then we get to the Windrush scandal. Now, I'm going to mention to you here a lady called Wendy Williams. Wendy Williams carried out an internal report for the Home Office, which was never published because the Home Office argued it was a personal opinion on her part, not their own official view. So it's never published. But she analysed legislation from 1950 to 1981. And she said the only conclusion she could come to, having looked at the various acts of Parliament, I'd go back to 1948 and Clement Attlee's Nationality Act, which was set out the racist template that we're still using today. But she only started at 1950. But anyway, she said all the acts basically provided for a diminution of the number of black, these are the words she quotes, black and brown peoples. So the acts made no pretense that they were anything else than racist. It was to keep out the black and brown people, let in the white Rhodesians, as they then were, let in the white South Africans, Australians, all the rest of it, New Zealanders. But we didn't want the colonial peoples in, the people who were our subjects. Don't forget, you're a subject to the Crown. And this is absolutely atrocious because, of course, these people lost their lives in the war, flying aircraft, bombing places, fighters. They were in the army. So our Indian volunteers and conscripts fought in Burma and everywhere. So these people were owed a decent deal and they were promised a passport. But when it came to the crunch, a few years ago, we discovered that children of these people who'd been born here, thought they were over here legally, discovered they weren't. And again, what's the fourth step of the Crown? It's to delay compensation. They haggle over every penny. Don't get me wrong, the Treasury is behind all this. They make sure that not a penny more than necessary is ever paid. And of course, if you're haggling over compensation, you're not going to get justice. And these people have not had justice. Now, in 2018, Theresa May promised to pay compensation to the Windrush. Indeed, Amber Rudd resigned when she thought she'd misrepresented to the select committee in question what was happening about the compensation. Then we got his name now escapes me. He was only in situ a very short time. He left the government to go back to. He was an MP down in the West Country, Tory, Asian Tory. Asian Heritage Tory. he promised it would all be done in 6 months. That was in 2019. Well, you can sing for it because it hasn't been. And these people are still waiting. Many have died. Many have died. Many will die. Some have been deported. Another thing that's characteristic of the Crown in these matters, these scandals, is to detain people without trial. This goes on a lot when people are trying to apply for visas to get into Britain, claiming to be British citizens. They lock them up and keep them waiting in detention. And the same goes on here. They're in detention here as well, as you know, people waiting for asylum applications to be resolved and so forth. So Wendy Williams produced this report, and I think it's worth having a look, looking it up on Wikipedia. It's really damning. And Human Rights Watch actually condemned the Crown for the way it treats immigration cases. It declared it was essentially torture, what they were doing, psychological torture. Okay, well, I'm not going to go on very much longer. You'll be glad to know. But I will just bring us up to speed with the post office scandal then, and say, frankly, that they are demonstrating all the best elements of a Crown scandal cover-up. They've got delayed compensation. I'm not going in order. They've got delayed justice. They've got delayed compensation. They've got secrecy. They've had documents shredded. They've had people lying to Parliament. They've had all sorts of stuff. All the best elements of a good Crown cover-up. And it's all in the post office scandal. So I've given you quite a few. But if you've only got time to go for one, I'd take a look at some of the inquiry cross-examinations carried out by Mr. Beer, as he's known. He is a very assiduous Maori heritage lawyer, very, very good. And he shreds these people, but in such a kind way. I've never seen anything like it. He's almost too kind to them. But he really makes a mess. So compensation is delayed. Inquiries are used to distract you. And if we think about what could be on the horizon, I don't get down the street in Broadstairs without being stopped about what do you think the next scandal is going to be, Phil, because they know I'm a bit interested in it. So I'll stop and talk to anyone about it. I think the next one's going to be the cladding scandal following on from Grenfell, which is one I haven't mentioned. But that possesses all the characteristics of the ones I've talked about. The cladding scandal will be the big one. They won't get compensation. The companies that are involved in these things were given permission by the government to put this material all over the country, will not be held responsible. Many of the MPs have got links to these companies. The Kensington Council in Grenfell's case, many of the councillors were involved in financially with it. So keep an eye for the cladding scandal. And I don't say this lightly. I'm not joking now. I'm serious. There will be another fire. Everybody who knows about it, Matt Rack, others in the FBU have said, they just know that because these things have not been addressed and the material is still up there on so many buildings, sooner or later, there's going to be another fire. And when that happens, you will see all the forces of the Crown coming out to cover it up. The Crown is a very, very British structure. And the reason why we've had longevity, continuity, stability ever since 1688, when the Crown sort of comes into being, is because our democracy is dysfunctional. It doesn't hold this massively powerful entity to book.
Thank you very much indeed, Phil. That was just shocking. When you put all those scandals together, the evil that has been perpetrated on people is just unbelievable. I want to move on now to we'll have questions later, but I want to move on now to Mark Metcalf to talk about the Hillsborough disaster, and I believe John Tubman also has a lot to say about the Hillsborough disaster. So I'm going to go to Mark Metcalf first, and then to John. So Mark,
this talk is in honor of Mohammed Barkat, who was a Palestinian international footballer who was killed in March of this year, and also in honor of the many Palestinian children who over the last few years, simply for the art of playing football, have been shot from distances by the IDF in their legs or have been executed. That said, I'm going to start back in 1934 when Frank Swift, probably England's greatest ever goalkeeper, entered the field at Hillsborough for Manchester City, who went on to win the FA Cup that season, and was forced to step over the dead body of a Sheffield Wednesday football fan who had been crushed to death on the terracing in the Cop end, which was the alternative to the Leppings Lane end, where the tragedy took place many years ago. Injuries and deaths at football grounds have been a large part of the game until relatively recently, when stadiums became all-seater stadiums. And it could be argued that the greatest thing that the people who campaigned for justice in the Hillsborough case did was to make stadiums much safer. At the same time, the introduction of that safety, the cost of that has been passed on to ordinary football fans by the fact that getting into particularly top flight football has gone up exponentially. So there's a negative side to that. You can't start Hillsborough and the discussion of Hillsborough, however, without looking back 4 years previously to that and the Bradford fire disaster, which took place at the same time at Heysel, but I won't go into that except to say with Heysel, as I know from experience, was a death trap of a football ground. But also at that point, hooliganism did play its part in that tragedy. That certainly was not the case at Bradford, where a fire broke out, and as a result of the structural parts of it, and the fact it was a wooden stand, 56 people were burnt to death. Within 13 days, an inquiry they'd started an inquiry, and it was over in record speed. The people who'd survived, who were in hospital, they didn't even get that opportunity to come along and speak about their experiences, and no great lessons were drawn from the fire. In essence, Martin Fletcher, who was at it with his dad and his uncle and his brother and his uncle's son, was the one of 5 who survived that tragedy. He was always uncertain as to whether the whole thing was necessarily a tragedy or an unfatal, accident as such. And a number of years later, when speaking to him, I pointed out that Paul Foote had at the time been given information by a firefighter friend of mine who's now long dead, Chris Hindle, who later worked for Elite City Council, battling to get, particularly in older people's homes, and ensuring that what was happening at that point was they were locking the fire escape things with safety bolts to prevent elderly, dysfunctional people, dementia, so they couldn't actually get out of those buildings. So these things do happen. And I pointed out to Martin that, in fact, there had been a number of other fires associated with the owner staff at Higginbottom. And that sort of inspired him in part to write an exceptionally good book, which I would certainly recommend, called 56, The Story of the Bradford Fire. The thing about the fires was not so much that they actually took place, and there were 9 other fires associated with Higginbottom's businesses. It was the fact that those fires, when they started, they weren't like ordinary fires. They just flared up and were massive fires very, 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 very quickly indeed. Martin's campaign work finally got the South Yorkshire Police to say they would re-look at the whole situation, but then they concluded there wasn't the information for a public inquiry to take place. It's my view that the difference, why that wasn't the case, is the difference in politics between Bradford as such and the politics of Scousers and Liverpudlian fans, and the fact that they had a much larger public base. And I think that's important to note. It's the politics of things which actually do lead to the state and the crown being forced into at least publicly looking for justice. And so I want to go to that about the situation. My view is if the Bradford City fans had campaigned continuously, I do feel the state would have at least had to set up something which would have demonstrated that the fire wasn't anybody else's fault. Obviously, for those who know me, they know that I'm part of the. I don't know if it's going to cost the most amount of money for a public inquiry, but to date it is cost. I think it's 88 million on a charade escapade looking at undercover policing. I'm glad to see, although I can't reveal the sums of money, certainly some of the women who ended up in relationships with undercover police officers, including the one that particularly spied upon myself, Mark Jenner, who I actually worked out wasn't what he was because he said he was a Tranmere Rovers fan, and I knew more Tranmere Rovers fans than he did when I went to the football match with them. So I worked him out, in essence, although not strong enough to challenge him. So the situation, well, anyway, 88 million's been spent on that inquiry. It's a small sum of money. I would anticipate long term that I would gain some compensation because I think I can demonstrate that when I was applying for jobs for a long period of time, the Met Police, when you had to do CRB checks, it's before I started writing full time, and my stuff was coming back. It was clearly inaccurate, and I wasn't able to gain any employment on that basis. But to be fair, it's a small and insignificant sum, but nevertheless, it was important to me. Right, Hillsborough, 1987. I was at the Leeds United versus Coventry game at Hillsborough. I'm not a Leeds fan. I'm a Sunderland fan, as people would know. And for those who don't know, Sunderland remains the only top-flight football team across Europe which was formed by a trade union, which in this case was the Teachers' Union. And obviously, I'm exceptionally proud of that fact, and I think it's only right that that should be the case. So anyway, I was at the match. I was with a young lad, a mate of mine, who actually would have made it as a professional footballer, but found God and still is still a follower of God as such, although at this time he's still in Birmingham as such. So when we went into that stadium, in the Leppings Lane End Stadium, I love Hillsborough as a ground. It's one of my favourite football grounds. I saw Sunderland beat Arsenal in 1973 in the FA Cup semi-final. Obviously, not quite as good as beating our friends from Elland Road in the final. But as it happens, it was still a great day out. And we got to the cup final in 1992 by beating Norwich. And I've written many football books about Sheffield Wednesday as well. And I will be possibly organising an event later this year around their 125th anniversary. However, despite that, obviously, what happened at Hillsborough, when it happened, my thoughts went back to that 87 final, and we were going down the main, basically the tunnel area, and I said to Gary, Bonnie lad, we're not going this way, and he said, why? I said, it's just not safe. And that had only been because of an experience in 84-5, when the Sunderland fans, as you would anticipate, took over that end. I think it was about 8,000 or 10,000 of us there, and it was pretty uncomfortable. And so we went the other way. So I knew, and in fact, I feel quite sad that I didn't actually make a fuss about that at that particular period of time. But it is interesting that Simon Inglis's great books, The Grounds of Great Britain, at that period of time, and I know that he probably feels, particularly, and Simon Inglis is a brilliant writer, there's no question whatsoever. He looked at those grounds and he talks about their quaintness, and the quaintness actually was they were bloody dangerous in many cases, which is why the Bradford fire took place, which is why Hillsborough took place. And it was why in the earlier part, 1946, the Bolton Stadium, many people were killed there during an FA Cup tie. So these were dangerous places. And what happened in 1989 is the previous season, Liverpool had also played Forest there, and they'd given Liverpool a club which is, to be fair, 10 times, perhaps not, 10 times bigger than Nottingham Forest. And they'd given them Liverpool are the second, probably the second biggest team in England after Manchester United, who dwarfs any other club in England without doubt. And they'd given them the small end, which was ridiculous, and that was purely and simply the prejudices of the West Yorkshire place. And so what happened is they'd been given that thing. The previous speaker has gone into some brilliance about how the Crown acts and operates. My experience of football in the 80s was that when you went to games, the police were violent, really violent group of people, and the places where you feared going were West York, South Yorkshire, the West Midlands, and down to the Met. And if you didn't end up in a row with the home fans, generally you would end up in a row with a place. They were brutal in their violence, and there was, however, violence on the Torrison at the time, and this was used as an excuse to put up fencing rather than improve the facilities, make it a better day out. Fences were put up, and they were to contribute to the tragedy. What can I say? We all know that at the point 95, then 96, and now it's accepted that 97 people were crushed to death on the Torrison. We know that the police opened the gates to allow supporters outside who came into the Torrison, and with no direction whatsoever went down the tunnel. And as a consequence of that, too many people were behind the goal, and people were crushed. People of all ages were killed. It's got to be said that part of this then became, their deaths became, I'll go on to the Sun newspaper in due course, but Hello magazine, one of the magazines at the time, actually dared to print photographs of the crowd as they were dying, which is never, the person that should have been as much done as the bastard on the Sun newspaper, Calvin Mackenzie. The police knew immediately what had happened, no question about that. There wasn't a safety certificate for that end. They had also, the lad who was in charge of the actual policing himself didn't have the experience to be marshalling such a ground. So it was shoddy. It was an example of the fact that they themselves didn't really care about this situation. There had been crushes at other semi-final games earlier. The Wolves Spurs game in '81, supporters from Wolverhampton Wanderers and Spurs, they were both forced onto the pitch, and that's the difference. There wasn't at that point any fencing up. For those who don't remember, back in '85, Chelsea had some right nutters. There's no question about that. They had a lot of lads. You went to Chelsea, and it was quite a fearful experience. Ken Bates's response to that was he wanted to put fencing up, and he wanted to electrify them. That was his position in 1984. Ken Bates is a very, very unpleasant man. I've been in his company a couple of times, to put it mildly. He had me banned from Leeds United, which, to be fair, the Football Writers Association prevented that happening, basically. And he had me banned because he knew I was a socialist. That's the only reason why that happened at the time. So the following, after the tragedy itself, South Yorkshire Police began operating a system to make sure that the football fans themselves were blamed for the disaster. Now, this is a double whammy for the people who'd come in late. They were being told that they were responsible for the deaths of their friends and their families and their fans, other people that they knew, that they were responsible. And that was added to by the fact that the Sun newspaper ran a story which was given to it, we know now, by South Yorkshire Police, which basically said Liverpool fans were pissed and that they were uncontrollable. That particular day, I can say for certain that isn't the case. I'd been stopping at Mansfield, my greatest female friend, pretty Polly shop steward for many, many years, Carol. And I'd come up, suddenly we're playing Oldham, so I'd gone through Sheffield. I had a pint in Sheffield, as it happens, before we went over to Oldham and watched someone draw twos apiece. And then we heard about the tragedy. How quickly does that develop? I can tell you within half an hour of the news on the radio, fellow fans of mine who actually got quite knocked about, to be fair, were saying, it's typical Scousers, all of that sorts of situations. This is the reality of working class politics, animosities between football fans, which the state and the Crown, they're astute, they're clever, they know how to tap into people's prejudices and to play on those prejudices. And so the following week, there was a minute's silence at the Shrewsbury, Sunderland played Shrewsbury. There were some people at the match who actually abused that minute's silence because they thought it was Liverpool fans. To be fair, they got hoyed out of the ground by the majority of fans. But the fact that people felt confident, that had a resonator with supporters. People had beaten Liverpool before, they'd been fighting at the football. So that all of those things contribute in a way. It also shows the lack of working class solidarity in the 1980s, which had taken place. Yeah, terrible, isn't it? Really, it's fucking shocking. The state, what they said was they would set up an inquiry. The Taylor report came out, took place, and to be fair, that inquiry did say, the Taylor report did say that it was the result of the failure of crowd control. So Taylor did identify at that point, but he also said, and don't forget, he was the director of public prosecutions, there was no evidence to justify prosecution of any individuals or institutions. What he did do was to lead to the greatest improvement in facilities at football grounds, inspired in part by a great friend of mine, Michael Knighton, who went on to be the chief director at Manchester United. All-seater stadiums were introduced and places did become safer. At the same time, we had an ongoing battle. Thatcher wanted the introduction of membership cards, restrictions, all those sorts of things. And football fans, under the burgeoning fanzine movement, of which I have to give great praise to When Saturday Comes, which is still a magazine which exists even now on terms of things, brought together ordinary football fans, and the Football Supporters Association, which again still exists today, was set up to campaign for football fans and for justice. It took, what can I say? I mean, it took Liverpool football fans a couple of years to start actually campaigning. There was the first campaign which was set up by the families, okay, and this caused some division because the families wouldn't allow other football fans, the friends of those who died and those who'd been left with great, heartache, great mental health problems. It wouldn't allow them to join with their organisation, and it became, I might as well say, it became too close, in my personal view, to what was happening. It was in part willing to accept some of the things that were being said to them. And now, from my point of view, when this happens, I'd rather, even now, all these years later, that statement was not necessarily used at this particular point. So I hear what people are saying, but I think that might want necessarily. I'm just sharing that with people. It was the Hillsborough Justice Campaign was set up by people who had been at the match, or football fans who knew what had happened. And we did know what had happened. I was one of the reasons I was a bit all over the place. People might have seen me shuffling around to find something, and I thought I'd put it online. The thing took place in April, the disaster, and in the second week of May, I wrote down what I knew, what had happened. Socialist Voice, they published it. I thought it was online, to be honest. I thought it was on my blog, but I can't find it. And I can't find the magazine at the moment. And basically what I'm saying is that whatever the state is telling you is a lie. The fact is the ground is unsafe. I mean, I'll find the article, and when I find it, I'll send it, and it can be demonstrated that was the case. Because by that point, having been to many football matches, having been to Orgrave, having been on many picket lines at that point, I knew that basically whatever the police were likely to say was likely to be a lie. I think they're the most pathological people for lying I've ever actually happened to meet. I think what you get, especially on big cases, is the whole state, the whole apparatus comes together. So it was that campaign, in essence, which drove things forward. During that whole period of time, of course, Sheffield had Labour MPs who were members of the government. They had left Labour MPs, significantly numbers of left Labour MPs. Not one of them, not one, supported the Hillsborough Justice Campaign or the Hillsborough victims. Not a single one. Orgrave, yeah, once that started, they supported them. But in terms of football fans, no, we were just a set of scum, to be frank, amongst most MPs. That's how people were regarded in terms of the situation. So there was no serious political support for that. What happened is, and I'd like to, in particular, praise here, without these things would never have happened. We couldn't have got to this point. And I say we because I identify myself strongly with that. The brilliance of Sheila Coleman and a lassie called Anne Williams in particular, but Sheila in particular, the research and the work that they put into this and the exposure of what was happening was simply superb. And they long term.
Mark, can I just come in here? We are now gone 8 o'clock, so if you could round up, because I want to give some other people a chance to contribute.
I'll finish in 5 minutes, no problem. So what happens is eventually on the 20th anniversary, there is what happens at Liverpool. Andy Burnham speaks, and he basically gets shouted down. And to be fair to Andy Burnham, he then says, "We've got to have a look. We have to have a look at this," and it leads to an inquiry, and that comes back, and basically there's an independent panel takes place, and that shows that what we knew all along, it wasn't their fault, and it wasn't Liverpool fans' fault, and long term it demonstrated that the Liverpool fans that were not to blame. It demonstrated what we already knew: the police were to blame, the fencing were to blame, the authorities were to blame, all of those situations. Going forward, only one person was ever held responsible, somebody at the ground. I think they got fined £5,000. All the rest of the main people, Duck and Field, all of them, they all got off. Obviously, Cameron got up in the House of Commons as Prime Minister 2012, apologised. So yeah, that's the story. I'm not going to go into how the Crown operates. I think that tells you how the Crown operates. Thanks for letting us speak anyway, and hope that's all right. Cheers.
Thanks very much indeed, Mark. So I've just, if anybody wants to contribute and or ask questions, please raise your electronic hand. So I've got Mike Hope first, and I'm going to bring in John Tumman.
Right. Well, thanks both of you. And the question I'm going to ask is related to what Phil was saying. But Mark, I would say uh, what what you tell us is doubly impressive because you are not just a recorder of history, you are a participant in that history to quite a significant degree. And I'm particularly impressed, for instance, with the fact that you managed to unmask one of these undercover cops who subsequently received great notoriety. But the question I was going to ask really is about the Crown and the state, which is well, I'd like to try and differentiate or not between when we talk about the state in its various forms and when we talk about the Crown. And in particular, I'd like to just sort of ask the question, right-wingers, American right-wingers, and then, since the era of Liz Truss, also in this country, have talked about the deep state, which sounds like a paranoid right-wing version of the Crown we're talking about. So we obviously need to be very clear about the differences. So I'd like to encourage some discussion on that. Just very briefly on some of the other things that Phil said. I mean, yeah, the immigration laws back in the day were explicitly racist. There is no question. But they still are, even, currently, the government and the Crown's preparedness after more reluctance than other European countries, but preparedness to have a scheme for Ukrainians is in massive contrast to their absolute dismissal of having any scheme for Palestinians who have been subject to things even perhaps worse than most Ukrainians. They've been subject to things that beyond belief. So really it's not, the explicit racism is not there, but it's very much the subtext to all of this, I think. I think picking also on Grenfell highlights the particular dismissal where it is black and brown people who suffer. And if you notice there that for 3 days after the horrific fire itself, was something quite unusual. Normally, the state, the Crown, moves rather fast. For 3 days, there was silence from Theresa May and the government. They said nothing. Jeremy Corbyn went in and hugged people and did all the things that he does really rather well. But there was this incredible silence. And as for Kensington and Chelsea Council, I don't think they've ever, they've never really emerged and fessed up to anything at all or come in any way clean. So, yeah, but this distinction between, what we're talking about in the state and what right-wingers talk about in terms of the deep state, I'd like to examine that a bit more.
Yes, very good questions, Mike. I'm going to bring in John now.
Thank you very much, Carol. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Right. Yeah. I want to thank both speakers very much. I think we've been very privileged to hear both of them. I think that Phil described the state very, very well, although I think Mike's question is a very pertinent one, and we do need to address it perhaps later on or in a separate meeting. And I thank Mark very, very much for actually telling us all about the way in which we as football fans were treated in the 1980s. I remember going to, I don't know whether, Mark, you've ever been to Leicester City during that period, but I was. You'd be amazed, I think everybody else would, at what exists outside that station or existed in those days. Outside the railway station was a cage which stretched up from the floor about 30 feet to the roof of this big yard, and you were encaged in that as you came out of the station as an away supporter. I've been marched upwards of 10 miles around ring roads before being allowed to go into a city or town centre. We were treated like absolute scum. And it's not surprising that quite a lot of football fans actually went on to behave like that too. But I really want to start in Scotland. In Scotland, Mark's gone through a lot of disasters. And my main point is that disasters which aren't a product of the planet are all preventable. And the disasters which happen to working class people have been all preventable. My father, now long since dead, born in 1920 in Paisley, just west of Glasgow, attended about 100 funerals at the age of about 7 or 8 of all the children in his class and in his school who'd attended a matinee at the local cinema. And there was a fire in in a room which was projected onto the screen. The kids panicked. The exits were locked, and the kids died on top of one another. Paisley, I went to visit in 1957 and 1958 when I was young with my parents. And the River Cart runs through the middle. There was a children's playground right next to the cart with no fence. Kids were drowning in it on a regular basis, and my parents wouldn't let me go anywhere near it. In Scotland too, there was the Ibrox disaster. I think it was in the interwar years or shortly after the war.
That was 71.
Pardon?
1971.
No, there was one way before that when
that was 1902 England-Scotland game at Ibrox, and then the next one was 1971.
Right. Well, I thought it was before that. I'm talking about the time when the Rangers fans had left.
That was 71.
And is it right?
Wallenstein
scored an equaliser, and they came back up the stairs and were met by fans going.
Right, of a late equaliser. They came back up the stairs and met the people who were coming out at that
1971.
point. And they crushed. Okay, Mark. Yeah. And that happened as well. As Mark said, a lot of football grounds were completely in a state of they were places where you shoved fans. My club, Wolves, had an end, the North Bank in those days, 9,000 people squashed into what was, by today's standards, was a very, very small terrace. And it was referred to as the cowshed because that's effectively what it was. It was made of wood. entirely the steps, the roof, everything about it. Just like Bradford, it was not surprising that one of those structures went up in 1987. As for Hillsborough itself, the thing happened. I wrote a report for the Football Supporters Association on all-seater stadiums because Jimmy Hill, who was doing the commentary on the BBC television, which was showing it live, used the occasion to promote all-seater stadiums. A year after that, I was at a conference called Football into the 90s at Leicester University, and David Kelly and the bigwigs of the FA were already discussing. I happened to get on the same table as them at dinner. They were all discussing forming a what became the Premier League, to cut out smaller clubs from it, make it into a closed shop, which is what they were talking about, with no relegation, no promotion. And also they wanted to create all-seater stadiums. And the effect of all-seater stadiums has been to gradually exclude most working class people from what was the people's game, and is the only working class people who can now attend, more or less, are pensioners and unmarried people of both sexes. At Wolves, we're currently fighting the club with a 14,000 strong petition over the increases, this round of increases in attendance fees and season tickets. They've risen them, given a load of paltry excuses. And that is typical. That's typical of the way that the game has gone. It's been taken away from the people. The Hillsborough was a preventable disaster, not just the way in which people were crowded into small terraces in front of fences. Those fences were always going to kill somebody. The police were very reluctant to let people through. They had gates cut into them, which were part of the fence, and those gates were locked. And whatever was happening, whether there was somebody bleeding to death on the terrace, they were always reluctant to open the gate to let people go and the St. John's ambulance tend to them. The conditions in which we were held and treated were absolutely awful. It's one of the worst things I've ever experienced as a football fan. As Mark said, Wolves played Tottenham about 7 or 8 years in a semi-final at Hillsborough. We had the Kop end, Spurs had the Leppings Lane end. There was no fence then, but several hundred Spurs fans were allowed to sit in front of an overcrowded stand. They had the same thing at Stoke. Stoke had a very similar away end to the Leppings Lane end. I don't like Hillsborough as a stadium. If you've ever sat on the front row of that stand in the seats, the rain comes straight in on you and soaks you through the skin. But anyway,
John, if we could just round it up now, please, and give other people a chance.
A good friend of mine from Scotland. He was the first. He's a Scouser. He was the first ambulance person onto the pitch and had to play God. His about who lives and who dies, who was the better risk of keeping alive and who wasn't. And his wife now has to finish sentences for him. Is in such a state still. He doesn't get any compensation. The people who got compensation for Hillsborough were the police who caused it. Thank you.
Absolutely shocking, John. Thank you very much indeed. I don't, I let's, has anybody else any questions or contributions that they'd like to make now? No, I can't see any hands up. So I'm going to bring Steve back in and then Phil to do some summing up. But thank you very much, John. Very, very moving contribution.
I'd like to say something as well.
Oh yeah, okay, Mark. Mark, I'll go first of all to you. Mark.
Yeah, a couple of things about the football. I've been to Leicester City many occasions. Slightly separate to this, I think I hold the record for having been on the most amount of what you describe league grounds when the clubs were actually in the league. It's over 150 football grounds that I've been on as I was going to football matches from the age of 6 or 7. So I'm pretty passionate about the football. In terms of the fact that somebody can't speak because of what happened, I'm not really too surprised. It's horrible, isn't it? They 41 of the 96 who died might have survived if they'd had proper hospital care and attention. We now know that some people were probably put into bags where they were very much alive at the situation. So that's a serious numbers of people. Again, it was ordinary football fans who worked on that. And Wolverhampton Wanderers played Newcastle at Hillsborough in 1951. The Wolves fans were in the Leppins Lane end, and there was a great crush, and they were put onto the pitch. The game continued whilst that happened. They moved the second game to Huddersfield and made that they restricted the numbers of people who actually could go to that game. So we are talking a long history. What I would say, and I think that's been covered by other people very much in that situation, the tragedy could have happened. It wasn't just Hillsborough, as has been explained. There were lots of unsafe grounds at that time. So it's not just the one location or the one place, the facilities or things. What is the deep state? I mean, is the deep state where somebody from the state rings you up and offers you a deal, as would be said, as involved in a campaign around refugees and asylum seekers? 5,500 people came to the Hackney area, and a government where in Hackney everybody was fine, was no bother. There was the government basically. I was a secretary of the support group. Somebody rings you up and says, if you don't make a fuss about these sorts of things, we can guarantee you that people will get their benefits, blah, 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 as long as you don't make a big fuss about this whole situation. It wasn't a deal which we were prepared to conclude or agree with, but it wasn't something that we actually publicised either. And the state, as far as I could see, without our agreement, went ahead and did keep to their commitment. Is that the deep state? Is that the crown? Is that how that operates? I suspect that in part is how it happens for very important people. They have their clubs, they have the places where decisions are taken and are made in those clubs. Obviously, they're all male clubs as such, so you could say Thatcher made a blow for equals rights if you wanted to. But that's what it is, isn't it? People from the same background, the same constitutions. And when these people talk about the establishment, it's because they're not part of that club, would be my view. They're not actually included. Yeah. What you find is that people are desperate to be included in that club, aren't you? So Starmer willingly took up to go to the Bilderberg group, and he's no doubt whatsoever now been included in those chats, those parties, all of those social occasions. I think the deep state is a group of people who meet socially and enjoy each other's company and enjoy the same levels of politics. That's what I think it is. And from that, that works its way into how decisions are taken and how decisions are being made. What we've got, what we've always had, is also the taking of working class leaders into their little club. Joe Gormley was undoubtedly one of those people who was enveloped in that. We have all of the major politicians in the Labour Party now who've been to America, who are part of that club. And that is the deep state. The state takes in the best people as they see it, the most able people, those who are corruptible, those for whom wish to leave this earth with a lot of money and a lot of power, and they bring them into it. That I've no doubt also some of the undercover police officers and others that do that do target people. They put them under pressure, and they do get them to become part of that whole service, for which they are, I would guess, pretty well rewarded. Throughout my life, personally, not on a much smaller level, constantly being offered opportunities to be better myself. I live in a working class estate in Halifax, social housing, but there's lots of other people I know I've been involved with politically who've gone on to do exceptionally well. So I suspect the deep state is that, to pick out people and to groom them and to make them part of that establishment. And frankly, I fucking hate them. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Mark. That's really revealing. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to go to Steve now.
Yes, just to make a couple of points. One, maybe to try to answer what Mike said, which the state, in a way, is a kind of abstraction. So when you're talking about the state, you could just as well be talking about the French state, the Israeli state, the American state. It's a kind of level of what's in common between all of them. You can compare them. But in a sense, when you're looking historically about how the specific state in which we live has evolved historically, then the crown, in a way, is the state. Or the crown it's the power of the crown is what has evolved from feudal times, when the crown and the king were more or less the same thing. There was no distinction between the crown and the king in feudal times. They were the crown and the king were the same, But it's through, as Phil pointed out, through the Glorious Revolution, through the 17th century, the crown begins to become not the same as the king anymore. Probably we chopped Charles's head up. We chopped King Charles's head off, and that was the point of separation, and reconstituted the crown as the power of the state. It's interesting that I think there's maybe one law that actually mentions a state in English law. It's always the crown. So I think the crown is really a kind of substitute for the state as it's formed in the UK, as it's historically evolved and developed. And so we can follow that through. And I think, as Mark said, the crown is that kind of nexus of power. And Tony Benn makes a point. When he's talking about the Constitution, he says what's really key to understand our Constitution is the question of oaths. People swear oaths of loyalty to the crown. It's a system of loyalty and power to that focal point of loyalty. And that's what kind of holds it, in that sense, the monarchy holds it together, holds the state together through that form of loyalty. I want to say one thing about what Mark said, which I think is brought out. Well, it's brought out in all of them, really. But crown power is a relationship between the crown and the people. It's a bit like the relationship between the employer and the worker. It's a power relationship, and therefore it's not fixed. It's subject to struggle. So there is a struggle going on between the struggle between the crown and the people is like the side of the struggle between employers and workers. And so you see that in terms of the police and the Liverpool fans. You see, because I think Mark made the point that because of the culture of Liverpool and Liverpool fans, they were able to force more of a retreat from the crown by campaigning effectively and waging a long battle for truth and justice. So the crown is not a fixed power. It depends on the struggle of people against it. And to end, my last point really is that what we want to take up in this election campaign is not whether Sunak or Starmer should have crown power, should be able to deploy crown power, but we want to challenge the very idea that what we need is a democracy. We need radical democratic change, and that's what we want to put in, which radical democratic change is not being offered clearly by Sunak or Starmer. So that's where the left ought to be positioning itself in this general election, to be making a case for radical democratic change. The Commonwealth, that is to say, as the phrase we use, as a state which puts the welfare and health of the people as its priority, which quite clearly we've seen in the case of football fans just didn't actually happen. So I'll finish there.
Absolutely, Steve. Well said. Phil, I'm going to bring Phil in now to do a summing up.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks to everybody who's contributed. Mark, particularly very interesting, and John as well, very interesting stories. I'm afraid I never have been a mega football fan, mainly because I was born in Watford. So this seemed little point really, after they fell out of Division 1 in 1969, I believe, might have been 70. No, they did come into the Premier League for a bit. Anyway, I don't want to go off on a tangent. Yes, scandals. Steve's point about the crown and its relationship with the population is well made. I think a lot of people confuse all this because they're bamboozled by the tinsel and stuff around the monarchy, which people tend to confuse the word monarchy with the crown, and that is easily understood because it's not explained at school. And also, I take up Mark's point about deep state. I'm very suspicious of anything about. Trilateral Commission I know about because I read about it in a serious academic study, so I'm willing to move on that one. But a lot of it is not very useful. It ends up down rabbit holes. But Owen Jones wrote an excellent book called The Establishment, which failed only in as much as it never really proposed a reform of Parliament as a solution to the problems he correctly discovered in the Crown structure, but he didn't call it. He called it The Establishment. If you read the first 50 or 100 pages of that book, it's got everything about those various groups that Mark was referring to. They met in 1949 or the early 50s in Switzerland, and it's definitely worth a read. So, I found that very useful to be reminded of. I think I have to confess I missed Iraq out. I feel very badly about this because it's obviously a very important one, but so much has been said about it. I thought I'd mention some of the other ones. And I think there is a sort of recipe book, which I'll give to Steve to maybe we can send it out to the group. There's a sort of Crown recipe for how to deal with these things. And I made it into a list of about 12 steps. So I'll send that out. I won't recite them now. Another area I think is worth noting is train disasters. We've had a number of rail crashes, and St Paddington was one, and Potter's Bar was another. There was another up in Scotland. And getting compensation in these things is incredibly difficult. There's a system for calculating what you get if you lose a leg or an arm or whatever. The actuarial table is really fascinating. And being dead is not really a guarantee of your relatives getting anything, as the post office, postmasters are finding out. So I would say another area that's scandalous is in a branch of the Crown in the police is deaths in police custody, which is an area which is completely ignored. It gets a mention when someone does die. I think there was one policeman actually convicted up in Leeds or Sheffield in 1969. Apart from that, they've got away with 1,640 of these. I'm very close to someone whose brother died in Brixton. He was suffering from psychosis, and he was killed in police custody. They denied it, and in fact, they have all these various formulae, don't they, at inquests for getting themselves off the hook. I think the other thing we need to mention is that nobody goes to jail. I mean, the 2007-8 crash can definitely be rooted back to specific decisions taken in the City of London and in banks. These were not a problem to discover because people like Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling spent a long time sitting around tables with them trying to work out how to stop the ATMs drying up. And we came within a whisker of a total financial collapse in London, and somebody should have paid for that. In fact, Lehman Brothers went down and only one person went to jail in the States for the financial crash there, which was absolutely horrific. I mean, subprime mortgages, all that, cost hundreds of thousands of people their homes. And in the end, no one went to jail for it. Apart from, I think, Madoff. I think he didn't quite make off with as much as he thought he would, and he got jailed. But intriguingly, our system of the Crown is copied in America because the federal government has all sorts of powers that are not, can be added to without too much problem. And what happened with the Fed who was responsible for overseeing the banking and sector in Wall Street, was that great change candidate, Barack Obama, the change candidate, he put the head of the Fed in again after he was in disgrace. He put him back in as head of the Fed after he took office. So all that thing about, Main Street and all that, and Main Street to the Wall Street, we were going to get asked for compensation. It never happened. So results from inquiries, yes, good point. But do they ever get put into practice? I would argue in most cases they don't. The post office scandal again illustrates this because the post office ran down the clock hoping to bankrupt the legal fees that make them so big that the sub-postmasters would have to give up. So very often people settle for compensation which is far less than that which they should have because they just haven't got the muscle to carry on fighting. So what other things could be on the horizon? I don't want to be too pessimistic, but I think the water companies will be a cracker. I reckon that's going to be a very big scandal. And that ties into this whole notion of privatization that somebody noted in the responses there as the gift that keeps on giving. It's absolutely amazing, isn't it? I mean, you can't go wrong if you've got shares in a water company, really. You're made for life, monopoly. And so I would say, yes, as regards the deep state, I would say it's comprised of many things. Some of them are, like the Rand Corporation was, a sort of semi-secretive think tank in America, but we've got Tufton Street. But these are completely uninterested in democracy. They operate on the fringes of politics. But do not underestimate the extent to which both Labour and Tories are involved with them. Many of Starmer's closest associates are ex-think tankers, and they move around. I mean, there's a woman who was in the tax Payers Alliance called Kate somebody or other. She's now deputy editor of The Spectator. They move around, but her views haven't changed. And lastly, I would just bring in no one goes to jail. That's right. I would just bring the last thing I'd say is that the bow on the top of this, or the icing on the cake, or the crown, if you like, the jewel in the crown is the honour system. So if you want to, if you want to deal with somebody like Diane Abbott, the first thing you do is offer a place in the House of Lords. Even though Labour's meant to be reforming it, that doesn't stop them allegedly offering peerages. And you can buy people off, little. I mean, Alan Bates was offered an OBE. Very, very correctly, he refused to accept it until Venables gave up her CBE. But you can see how these things function. The Crown is a very crafty setup. It aims to not kill off opposition like would happen in, say, France or Germany by violent intervention. If that can be avoided, what you do is you just absorb it. So criticism is often absorbed. People are offered, peerages or various things like that. So my conclusion would be the Crown is a very multifaceted operation. It isn't a deep state in my book. It's something distinct from that. And I would say deep states are influential on the Crown. Deep state sort of conglomerates, people operating like in the these various groups that have been mentioned, but they are not in and of themselves the Crown. They're a different thing. They're associations of people who seek influence. And we can see how that worked in the PPE scandal and all those other things. And Mrs. Moan is offering a hand with the water scandal. Apparently, she's prepared to offer to provide support in this difficulty the government's got with the water system. So, but she's still on her yacht, so perhaps we might have to wait for that.
Right.
And if you have been, thanks for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Phil. That was a great summing up, I think. The whole thing is beyond shocking, really, the way the Crown kills individuals, the way the Crown ruins individuals and really doesn't care. They just don't care, and they get away with it. We need a change of system. That's what we need. We need we've got a national health service, we need a national legal service so that everybody has access to the law, not just the rich. So many things that have to change. We have to change the system. So I just want to say thank you very much to our speakers tonight. It's been an amazing meeting. There's so much that's been said that's so interesting and shocking and sad when you consider what's happened to these people. It's awful, and we need to change the system so this can't keep on happening. We need to get rid of the Crown. We need to get rid of the monarchy. We need to have power coming from below, from citizen assemblies, from regional assemblies, so that the sovereignty is with the people, not with these, quite frankly, psychopathic individuals at the top.